You're listening to The Voluntary Life, where you can hear ideas for finding freedom in an unfree world. Visit thevoluntarylife.com to connect with the show and hear all past episodes. Here's your host, Jake.
Hi, it's Jake here. Welcome to The Voluntary Life. This week I'd like to share with you some of the most amazing ideas that I have come to understand from various thinkers, and I'll provide lots of links in the show notes. And these are all to do with one overarching idea, and that idea is the potential, the possibility of living without politics, of living beyond politics, not just individually, but in general. So in order to explain what I'm talking about, let me give you some background. First of all, I want to tell you about a framework for thinking about how people make a living. This framework was developed by a German sociologist called Franz Oppenheimer in the early 20th century. And what Oppenheimer said was that essentially there are two very different ways of making a living. And he called these two ways the economic means and the political means. And the idea behind this distinction is that the economic means of supporting yourself or making a living is essentially to engage in productive activities, to create new value in the world through making things, through voluntarily trading things, and generally getting what you want in life by productive activity and persuasion, cooperating with others on a voluntary basis. And that's what he called the economic means. And then he contrasted this with the political means. And the political means of supporting yourself is essentially taking resources from other people or forcing other people to act as instruments of your will, either through direct force or through the threat of force, sometimes very indirectly through large organizations. But ultimately, the big distinction is between supporting yourself by being productive in the economic means or supporting yourself by forcing other people to do things for you. And I find this a super useful framework to keep in mind. Ultimately, that is the distinction between what's sometimes called civil society, which is people getting along voluntarily, cooperating, collaborating, building things, being productive, and the state or political society, which is, government, bureaucracy, the army, police, politicians, of course, all of the organization of the state. The fundamental distinction is between productive people who create value and political people who force other people to do things for them, either through the direct use of force or through the threat of force. Now, the idea is that whatever you choose to do in life, you've got to support yourself somehow. You've got to make a living or sustain yourself somehow. And what Oppenheimer was suggesting was that you're either going to do this by being productive or you're going to do it by using the political means. And this fundamental distinction, is the distinction between people of peace who cooperate with each other and warriors who take things by force and by threat. And Oppenheimer suggested that when you look at human history, we have progressed towards more economic means. We humans have found a way to move away from a reliance on the political means, taking things from each other and fighting each other, and more towards the economic means of being productive, cooperating voluntarily. And in particular, since the Industrial Revolution, we've had this explosion of productivity of the economic means and are moving away from violence and force. And Oppenheimer also suggested that we could evolve to a point where we don't have politics at all, where everything is organized according to the economic means, where all activities are voluntary. And this I've spoken about before, is that the idea ultimately that we could use entrepreneurship to solve all social problems. And many other people have had this idea and talked about it too. A quote that I like is a quote by Henry David Thoreau from his book on civil disobedience. And he says, "I heartily accept the motto, that government is best which governs least. And I should like to see it acted up to more rapidly and systematically. Carried out, it finally amounts to this, which I also believe. That government is best which governs not at all. And when men are prepared for it, that will be the kind of government which they will have. So that's the distinction between the economic means and the political means, civil society and the state. And each one of us then is either part of civil society or as part of the state. But what about those things that the state does, that however badly it does them, or ineffectively, are definitely necessary? Like the provision of law courts and catching criminals, protection against invading armies, and many other things besides. Well, here's where I want to share with you the idea that all of those functions could be provided by civil society using the economic means, by voluntary means. And I want to share with you an idea by an economist called Gustave de Molinari, who was writing in the 19th century, a European economist. And he pointed out a very simple contradiction in the way that we think about markets. He pointed out that everyone understands that monopolies are bad for consumers, but everyone also thinks that we need a monopoly in certain services, such as the production of security. So everyone thinks that the only way to provide security, to provide for police and law courts and so forth, is through a monopoly where there's just one state that does all of that. And de Molinari pointed out these can't both be true. It can't be the case that monopoly is bad for consumers, and yet we think we need monopoly when it comes to certain industries or certain services, like, for example, security. De Molinari pointed out the straightforward, simple, logical inference, which is that if monopolies are bad for us consumers, then the state monopoly that the state grants itself and enforces aggressively over industries like security is also bad for us consumers. And he went on to outline how things that we think can only be provided through politics could actually be provided voluntarily, through entrepreneurship, basically. Now, if this is the case, then we can apply the standards of the economic means of making a living, of entrepreneurship, of voluntary interaction to the state. And we can look at how does the state stand up to those standards. And I'm going to read you another quote which I really like, which is from a recent book by a guy called Michael Huemer. And he says this: "Imagine that someone proposed that the key to establishing social justice and restraining corporate greed was to establish a very large corporation, much larger than any corporation hitherto known, one with revenues in the trillions of dollars. A corporation that had a monopoly on some extremely important market within our society and used its monopoly in that market to extend its control into other markets, and hired men with guns to force customers to buy its product at whatever price it chose, and periodically bombed the employees and customers of corporations in other countries. By what theory would we predict that this corporation, above all others, could be trusted to serve our interests and to protect us both from criminals and from other corporations? If someone proposed to establish a corporation like this, would your trepidation be assuaged the moment you learned that every adult would be issued one share of stock in this corporation, entitling them to vote for members of the board of directors? If it would not, is the government system really so different from this scenario as to explain why we may trust a national government to selflessly serve and protect the rest of society?" And that's by Michael Huemer. And that, I think, is exactly the right way to view government, by the standards of entrepreneurship and voluntary interaction. Because the point is this: whenever anyone uses force, it needs to be justified. Being nice to people, interacting peacefully, cooperating voluntarily, using the economic means doesn't require justification. There's no potential crime being committed in being nice to other people. But if you use force, then you have to have a justification, because if it is aggressive force, if you are initiating force, then it's morally wrong. And essentially the only really justified use of force is in self-defense or against somebody who's already aggressed against you. So the point about politics, the political means, and the state is that if ultimately it's not necessary that we could organize society entirely peacefully, then the state is just this bloated monopoly that grants itself special powers based on the initiation of force, based on aggression. I'll put some links in the show notes so you can read the articles themselves. And there are many other people who have written many other things on this subject, but I just wanted to give you that framework for thinking about how people make a living, either by the economic means or the political means, and the idea that we could live in a world without politics, where everybody cooperated and collaborated together on a voluntary basis, where essentially we use entrepreneurship to solve all social problems peacefully without the resort to force or the threat of force. Now, I don't think that we're going to reach that world that de Molinari or Henry David Thoreau were talking about in my lifetime. I don't think that's going to happen. We do live in a political world. There is a state. And just because we could live without politics doesn't mean that we will. And so the purpose of this podcast is not to get you to think about a future that might not happen for generations or might never happen. What I'm interested in is what this means for what you choose to do with your own life and how you choose to make a living. Because if politics is ultimately unjustified, because we could provide all goods and services voluntarily, we could cooperate peacefully to solve social problems using entrepreneurship without the use of the political means, then the rational approach to the political system and the state, as far as I'm concerned, is to treat it as a fundamentally illegitimate, unnecessary institution and have as little to do with it as possible. Politics is always based ultimately on force or the threat of force. And the way that I view politics then is as something that's not a necessary evil, but just an unnecessary evil that we have and that we suffer under. You know, for thousands of years, people were born into societies where slavery was an established institution. And there were loads of people who thought that it was an inevitable and necessary part of society to have slavery. But we know that it wasn't a necessary institution. It was just an institution that existed. If you were born a few hundred years ago, you'd be surrounded by slavery. You might even be a slave, depending on where you ended up. And that would just be a part of the world. But it wouldn't make it right. And just because something is pervasive, it doesn't make it right. And now everyone considers that institution to be not just unnecessary, but morally wrong. What I'm talking about is just applying the same logic to the entire concept of politics per se, of using aggression to force people to do things. That's the way I view politics in our world. But you don't have to get involved in politics. You can devote your life to doing productive good and just ignore the vicious, messy, and violent thuggery that is politics. Of course, we still have to survive within a political world, and I pay my taxes because I don't want to go to prison. And where I have to, I live with the laws that are passed by the political system. But I don't waste any of my precious time and life getting involved and interested and engaged in a system that is fundamentally wrong. Politics is just a dirty business, and it's a business that's based on a means of supporting oneself, the political means, which is to use aggression to extract force from other people, which I see as both illegitimate and unnecessary. Now, I'm not suggesting that I've made the case for how we could have a stateless society and how we could have entrepreneurship solving all social problems in this podcast. But what I do want to do is let you know that if you investigate that outlook, if you investigate that possibility, and you come to view the economic means and the political means in this way, in the way that I've described in this podcast, then you come to see it as crazy to waste any time that you don't have to on politics, because it's a fundamentally dirty game. And I'm going to give you an illustration from a movie to illustrate how I think about this. And this quote is totally going to date me, because it's a super old movie. It's from the 1980s and it's called War Games. But it's a great quote. And so the idea of this movie is that an intelligent computer is in control of America's nuclear missile launch capability, and it takes control for itself, and it's going to launch a nuclear war, a nuclear strike on Russia. And everyone in the war room's going crazy trying to work out how to stop this artificially intelligent computer from launching nuclear Armageddon. And the way that they can teach this computer is through games. They show it to simulate the outcome of games, and they get it to simulate the outcome of nuclear war. And they're trying to teach it that there's no way to win a nuclear war, that whoever launches first gets destroyed anyway because the other side launches their nukes back and the whole planet just gets nuked. And just before the computer's about to destroy the world, it simulates all these different scenarios, and it stops because it realizes, it learns that there's no way to win that kind of war. And it comes back and says, it's a strange game. The only way to win is not to play. And that's exactly how I feel about politics. It's a fundamentally dirty game, and the only way to win is not to play. If we ultimately don't need a state, that we could do things differently, then there's no excuse for wasting time on a vicious system that's based on force or the threat of force. My suggestion to you is steer clear of politics and devote your time to living as productively, happily, doing as much good in your life through means of voluntary persuasion that you can. But I just wanted to share that with you as food for thought, because I really do mean it when I've been talking about how we could live in a world of entrepreneurs, a world where everybody worked for themselves and everybody cooperated with each other peacefully and productively. And I mean, given how much I talk about entrepreneurship, it's not going to be surprising to hear me say that I think that you will get much more freedom and fulfillment and joy in life if you are not involved in politics, especially not in the way that you make a living and support yourself. So I hope that's interesting food for thought. I'd love to hear what you think. If you enjoyed this, then check out my new book, Becoming an Entrepreneur, How to Find Freedom and Fulfillment as a Business Owner. It's on Amazon, and you can also find it on thevoluntarylife.com. Just click on the tab marked Books.
Thank you for listening to The Voluntary Life. If you have feedback about the show, please email jake@thevoluntarylife.com. If you enjoyed this program, please share the podcast with your friends or click the donate button on thevoluntarylife.com.